process of completing or starting or undertaking their PhD, or people who perhaps graduated and got their PhDs and are considering how to proceed within the academy. The academy is a space that I'm very interested in as well. Talk a little bit about that. My talk is very messy, as I was saying to you earlier. It is a bit messy. And you'll see at the end when I sort of end with like, now what? And I think one of the reasons it's messy is because there is a lot of overlap. There is a lot of what is sometimes called intersectionality, not necessarily in the theoretical sense. Lots of overlaps, lots of challenges, lots of conflicts, and lots of confluences of experience, I guess. And that's the other thing. I'm coming from an experiential sort of point of view. On the way over, Brett and I had a bit of a chat, and Brett telling me he's writing his book, and it's about theory. Don't hate me because it's about theory. Words to that effect. I don't hate theory. I just feel that it needs to be in proportion to what it is that's meaningful. So theory is valuable, Brett. I appreciate that. But sometimes I have encountered quite a lot of academics who get very, very fixated with the salience of theory, and it gets in the way of anything beyond that. That's one view. Anyway, okay, so let me proceed. So I don't know if anybody's seen the blurb. Let me see if I can try to move this thing out of the way, actually, a bit. Oh, it's gone down at the bottom. But anyway, so that was stuff in the blurb, right? This is what Brett asked me to write, or somebody asked me to write, and that's what I've distilled from that. That's kind of, I'm going to do some of that. I'm going to do some of that as well. So some of that involves like denouements and asides. I try not to be cynical, but partly it's my sort of training and my experience as well that pushes me towards that. So I think at the end it says maybe something on cars at the bottom there. So there's a couple of slides on cars and research and stuff. But for the bulk of this, it's really about, as I said, an invitation to predominantly early career researchers to consider their own place within the academy and what the point of their professional existence might be. I'm not insisting, by the way, and I'm not compelling people to do something that they might be uncomfortable with. In and amongst that, there's some quite vibrant and relevant terms at the moment as well that we'll try to cover. So let's talk about me for a bit. Introduction. Like, yeah, I get it. All right, yeah. I'll try to be quite short. So my trajectory into HE is what is in the literature sometimes referred to as, does anybody know? What's the word that people talk about when people go into university? They're either one thing or they're another. So there's traditional and non-traditional. Maybe that's a bit outdated now. I don't know. So I would say that my trajectory was not traditional. So when I was at school, born and brought up in Bradford, by the way, in West Yorkshire, we've had electricity and water for quite a few years, in case anybody's interested. So yeah, I was born and brought up, but when I was at school, I went to a school that was, this is my upper school, comprehensive school. It was very ethnically diverse. So, and it was also diverse in terms of class composition as well. So there were kids in my school, in my class, who were from the local area. And at the time, the local area where the school was predominantly middle class, white middle class, and some minority ethnic families lived there as well, but they were invariably professional backgrounds, doctors, lawyers, and that sort of thing. So it was a nice middle class, leafy part of the city. And it was over there, and it took me 2 buses to get to school. My class was quite diverse. And the interesting thing happened at the time of my, what were then called O levels. They'd be GCSEs now, right? The interesting thing that happened, what I felt at the time, I mean, it was bizarre that I remember it, not retrospectively remembering it. It's like all the white kids and the kids who were known to have parents who were doctors and whatever. So the kid I sat next to was a kid from Kuwait, whose dad was a medic, he was a surgeon. They got the talks about the universities. What university you're going to go to, what you're going to read at university, right? What you're going to do next. Everybody else, I was from a place called Manningham in Bradford, and that's semi-notorious, I would say. I wouldn't call it that myself, but it's got a reputation for all sorts of things. We got different talks. We didn't get talks about university. We got talks about what line of business are you going to go into? Does your dad have a shop? You want to go into the family business? Or do you, maybe there's jobs going at the local factory or the textile mill or whatever. Bradford was at the heart of the British textile industry, certainly worsted textiles, worsted spelt. So we had expectations that were layered and thrust upon us, which is interesting in and of itself, sociologically. This was years before I ever professed to be or even claimed to be a sociologist. So there's that stuff going on. And the weird thing is, right, some of you guys might get freaked out by this, but this might sound really parochial. I didn't even know where the university was until I was in my 20s. Well, until I was in my late teens. And I say this because I went to a concert with a friend of mine whose band were playing at that concert at the university, in the university grounds. There's like a big sort of stepped amphitheater, and my friend, his band was like a ska two-tone band, so we went to see them, and we saw them on the university grounds. I didn't know I was on the university grounds until years later. So that's how kind of, if you like, uninformed I was about what the hell university was. It was certainly not within my expectations. So whatever it is that constituted my identity at the time didn't really point to university or HE. And I went to university in my late 20s to do my undergrad degree, prior to which I'd done quite a lot of what I would call work, not what I'm doing now. Sorry. But yeah, blue collar work. I worked in textile mills. While I was studying, I worked in a takeaway, frying stuff, sold vacuum cleaners, did all sorts of crap jobs. And then I find myself in university, and for the first 10 or 12 years of my career in university, it started with sort of jobbing research, doing bits of research projects when proper academics had buyouts from their ESRC funded grants. Did some teaching. Anybody needed any teaching, I was the go-to guy. I was sometimes literally 1 or 2 pages ahead of the students to anything. I taught organization studies. I taught sort of study skills. I taught research methods. I taught, ethnic relations. I taught literature. You want me to do anything? I'll do it. You want me to build you a brick wall? I can do that. I'll do it. And there was a weird thing that was going on at the time, and it's only through sort of hindsight. It was actually, I was very appreciative to be in that space. I felt very privileged, and I felt out of place at the same time. So any kind of overtures toward me were gratefully received. At the same time, I developed what turned out to be a lifelong relationship, friendship with the guy I still work with now, informally, who's retired, a guy called Charlie Husband. And his background is white, middle class, originally working class from the Northeast. His big shtick, his big thing was ethnic relations and race inequality. And we'd met 30 years before, but neither of us knew it, because he was one of the parents who protested at the school, Drummond Middle School, where Ray Honeyford was the headmaster. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that bit of ancient history. Ray Honeyford, headmaster of a middle school, largely populated with non-white kids and some white kids. And he wrote an article in the Salisbury Review, 1976-77, basically saying black kids and brown kids hold down the progress of white kids. For a headmaster to be coming out with that stuff was minorly problematic. My man, Charlie Husband, was there with his placard saying, Honeyford out, Honeyford out. I was at the school at the time that was going on. So it's weird, right? So how things happen. So it's not exactly destiny or anything romantic like that, but it's just weird. So Charlie was really instrumental, white, middle-class guy, more than a generation beyond me in terms of his age, but politically very, very similar. We learned, I think, a lot from each other. So for the first 10 or 15 years in the academy, imposter syndrome was pretty much there all the time. And maybe some of you guys feel that, maybe not. Can have conversations outside of this about what that can look like and how it comes to be, in a sense, whether it's to do with class or race or anything else, and the fact that you're in a middle class institution predominantly. At the same time that I was studying my undergrad, I started writing. I started writing fiction. I started writing academic stuff. So yeah, I was published, I think, in my second year as my undergrad. And then I continued. I just like writing. So I got away with writing and some of it got published. And then I had difficulty kind of managing the kind of literary stuff and the academic stuff. And I jumped into kind of academic stuff because it was deemed to be, I don't know, deemed to have a different level of gravitas. And I'm not sure if that was true. So I guess what I come to be now is somebody who's got that sort of experience and now much more comfortable embracing who it is that I think I am in terms of what I think I'm doing when it comes to producing research. It's taken me a long time. And sometimes I do wonder, and I do wish I'd have listened to people like Claire, who's not here, Claire Alexander. So she was on a steering group of one of the earlier projects that I did. And she sort of said to me, well, maybe you need to own the space a bit more. Maybe think about how your voice feeds into this writing that you're doing about this research. And I was like, this is madness. I'm not going to do that. Because I need to hide behind references, right? I need evidence and all this stuff. So, I mean, I took some of what she said on board, but it took a long time for it to dawn on me that actually I have a lot of agency. The problem with having agency and recognizing it are two different things. And so I would invite you guys to maybe consider recognizing some of that. Okay, so what do we think we're doing as researchers? And maybe there's other stuff I've missed. I'm pretty sure there must be. So what do we think we're doing? Well, we're researching idiot. Why kind of stupid question is that? But what does that mean? What does it look like? What do you hope to achieve with your research? What difference does it make? And to who does it make the difference? Right? Let's be honest. If you're going to be, I'm not saying you should be or you are, but a job, if you find yourself working in a university, something transactional is happening, right? You work, and for that work, what do you get in return? This is the interactive bit. You get money, right? You get paid. It's labor. No different to any other form of transaction, right? The weird thing is, like, there are academics in the room. You ask them how many of them work 36 and a quarter hours a week, which is what I get for my workload, by the way. But we convince ourselves that this is important work and we need to do it well, and therefore we need to expend more time. And we tell ourselves that actually we get rewarded reasonably well. Maybe there might be some differences of opinion, but now I'd say more and more likely people are saying, at least I'm in a fucking job. So at least I'm in a job, right? So there's balance, but there's checks and measures as well, There's a huge amount of tension between what is called work-life balance. Ask Brett, ask other people who work in academia, when they switch off, when they switch on. Sometimes it never happens. You're always on. That is one of the things I want to talk about when it comes to ethnography as well. So what difference do we think we make in the larger scheme of things? And I would say individually, very little. Maybe there are a few rock stars out there, sociologists, academics who, the Giddens of the world who tells Blair what is the third way, and then the next thing you know, we're all in the shit. Fine. But generally speaking, not really massively going to change the world. Collectively, it's a different story, right? So I think that's where some of the value lies, considering our own agency within a bigger swirl of whatever is academic consciousness. I'm not saying that we all have to agree politically on everything, but there is the academic pursuit, and that is a professional identity. And thus we constitute a community of practice. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the work of Liv and Wenger, talking about all sorts like coppers, nurses, whatever. There are things that these communities do that are transferable within those communities. They recognize each other. It's a bit like Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, I guess. So anyway, look, what we do, why we do it, not always simple to answer. So moving on a little bit, insider research. Insider research is really, really, really potentially damaging. We don't really talk about that even those you guys who are doing insider research, you're talking about ethic, emic, and all that stuff, right? Lovely, you know the phrase is great. You find it difficult to crowbar in, and the fact that I'm using the word crowbar speaks volumes, right? How it feels. Because research is a human endeavor, unless you're kind of messing about with lab rats and doing stats. You know, I like this phrase. I can't remember where I got it from. There are two types of research. One is about numbers, and one is about not numbers, right? So when we're doing stuff that's not numbers, when we're getting to know people and insider research, and you know, if you're an ethnographer, you've got to be in the field, you've got to immerse yourself. That's all part of the game. The potential to do harm, not only to the people, the communities, the groups that you're researching, but actually the thing that sometimes is off the page, the potential for you to do harm to yourself is ridiculous. And we seem to not exactly ignore that. We seem to gloss over that to some extent. I think that's problematic. Added to which, you know, depending on how you define yourself as an insider, it could be by ethnicity, it could be by class, it could be gender, it could be political consciousness, whatever. You belong to the group that you're studying. That's one of the definitions of insider research, right? So it cannot be anything other than a political act. I'm not saying it's an act of representation, but there is certainly a politics at play here. Because what you are doing is you are demonstrating to your reader, to your audience, whatever, that this is about you. And again, we tend to hide that. We don't always use the word objective or scientific or the method or all that. But what the fuck is wrong with saying this is about me? Not just about me, but it's about the other people. It's a difficult, because then we enter into, it's a difficult conversation because we enter the terrain of, well, overly subjective, it's narcissistic. You know, this is especially the case with things like autoethnography. You know, there are some really interesting bits of writing about how autoethnography has been lambasted to some extent because it's just some nutter writing about their experiences. And I would say it's a bit more sophisticated than that. So yeah, when you are researching and those issues are at play, power, marginality, inequality, you cannot help but to divorce that context from what it is that you're doing, and to some extent why, and possibly even how. I'll talk a little bit, well, so the two examples from my own case, there's probably a few more. There's examples relating to literature as well, but I won't bore you with them. But when we ended up doing some prevent research, when we produced a book, I think there's an image of the book in one of the later slides. And it was on the back of another piece of work that we'd done. And we were invited to submit for some funding by a bunch of local authorities in West Yorkshire. And they said they wanted us to do some more work, and they wanted us to look at cohesion more broadly. I'm not particularly a fan of that word. So we've kind of locked in a proposal, and it was fine, it was great, it was going. And we're going to look at really the tensions between, on the one hand, counter-terrorism policy, prevent, and then these weird policies at local levels trickling down from Whitehall around the idea of social cohesion. Sorry, I was just about to do air quotes, but I won't. So there was this tension between what was being said in social cohesion and then what was happening and what was being said through prevent. And they didn't seem to match up. There was a kind of schizophrenia at play. But at some point, early on, while we were in that process of securing the funding, it transpired that some of the funding was coming through prevent money, right? We didn't know this at the time. But the minute we found out, you know, I was working with Charlie Husband at the time. We said, nope, not interested. We're walking away. That is tainted money as far as because as far as it was a political act. We didn't agree with the ideology of prevent, of the places that it came from, the assertions that it was built on. So we walked away. And as it turned out, the people who wanted us to do the research were either mad enough or really believed in us to do the research. They found money from elsewhere. I mean, it's perfectly possible that they did a bit of creative accounting and, you know, funneled one stream of money into anything else. But as far as we were concerned, it appeared to be that the provenance was less tainted. So we ended up doing that. But that was a risk, I mean, it was a risk to our own sense of political identity, I guess, who we thought we were. But actually, there was a real risk of blowback as well. You know, if you belong to a community and you're doing research about that community effectively, and what comes out isn't particularly positive, well, you're the target, right? You're the one with a cross on your back. In 2001, 2002, I was a research, this is when I was back in the days of doing anything. I was a research assistant on a project that looked into forced marriages. It was funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And I was very naive, very young. I thought the world was fair. Kind of idiot thinks that. So I was doing some research around, I was interviewing people doing focus groups around the idea of forced marriage. Some really interesting stuff came out in terms of data from different groups, right? And I had a habit of overwriting. I just liked writing. So I would send in my field notes and I would send in passages to be included in the report. And some of them were critical based on the data that was being generated, right? This focus group said this. Generally speaking, they're not particularly happy with the way in which forced marriage is presented as something pathological, for example. And I assumed that would make it the final report. But guess who would write a veto on the report? Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Didn't make it in the final cut. So again, you know, it means that whatever's produced is authored to us, but actually it's not. So you've got to be careful about that sort of stuff as well, risk. At the moment, I'm just finishing off a bit of research. We'll talk about that in due course. And that is turning out to be quite interesting, to say the least. Okay, so research, there's literary stuff up there. There's sort of oral history stuff. And then there's what you might call kind of more bona fide academics. Throughout, though, the theme is my relationship generally with my communities. So my communities can be sliced in different ways. It can be about age, it can be about gender, it can be about ethnicity. And mostly the one thing that's consistent is that of class and place, right? Insiderness is what you make of it, is how you define it, I would argue. So I'll talk a little bit about cars. How many people drive, can I ask? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Maybe half? Okay. I kind of like, you know, when I meet people for the first time, start talking about whatever. Well, invariably, cars are ubiquitous everywhere, but they are kind of a sort of ubiquitous in our thinking as well. So I've asked you before, Brett, but I've forgotten. But I'm not going to ask you this time yet. I always end up asking people, what do you drive? And then I make really horrible judgments about them. It's a shit car. Why do you drive a shit car? Kidding. So what do you drive at the back? Can I ask? What sort of Kia is it? Is it one of these new fancy ones with the bright lights and stuff? Yeah, but the new ones are like kind of like UFOs, like and stuff. No. Good car, Kia. Good warranty. Practical, pragmatic car. No, good car, good decision. I'm speaking like I'm some fucking expert. I'm the new Clarkson. At the back, you put your hand up. Can I ask what you drive? Oh, you can drive. Did you have a car recently, or do you aspire toward a car? What sort of car do you fancy? Ah, okay. Well, another one who's being pragmatic and sensible. The reason I ask, well, I when I did the cars research, I spoke to lots of people. Spoke to one young woman, South Asian heritage woman, and she was like, "Well, I'm learning to drive." Okay, and what car do you think you'll like to have? And she said, "Well, I don't know, maybe an Audi, maybe a BMW, or maybe a Mercedes." I'm like, "You're 12 years old. What is the matter?" She wasn't 12, but she was like 19 or something. Like, how are you going to afford that? How are you going to afford the insurance? I mean, in Bradford, the insurance rates are ridiculous. I said, "Well, you know, it's maybe down the line, but to begin with, I'll get something else." And I said, "Well, what's the something else?" And then she said, "Oh, maybe a VW Golf." I'm like, "I don't drive a fucking VW Golf. I can't afford it." I said, "Why don't you get a nice little Micra or a Toyota Yaris?" And you know what happened was amazing. She went, "Ugh." She said, and it's actually in the book, there's a quote from her. She was a lovely girl from Bedford, I think. And she said, "I'd rather not drive." I'd rather take the bus. I was like, this is amazing. This is like such amazing data, right? Cars are deeply meaningful to a lot of people, but not everybody. One of the big variables, two variables, but one of the big ones, when we talk about variables and when we talk about markers of identity, what do you think is the biggest variable in terms of meaningfulness, outward expression of meaningfulness in relation to cars? What do you think is a background marker that seems to be producing different uses and valuings of the car? And class is something out of this world when it comes to consumption generally, right? And you know, people like Bourdieu writing about this sort of stuff when he did this massive questionnaire back in the 70s, distinction, a study of class or taste or whatever. And it was borne out in the research, right? So I remember talking to what I would call middle class people, regardless of their ethnicity. Uh, and they would say things like, and then I would talk, well, I'll give you a couple of stories. Stories are good, right? People like stories, unless they're really shit, they're boring stories. So I'm interviewing somebody in Bingley, which is a nice leafy sort of middle class part of the city. South Asian woman. She's a professional. She works in mental health or something. So I just managed to secure an interview with her. So at some point we start talking about the cars in the city of Bradford. Now, I don't know if any of you guys know, but Bradford has a huge reputation for cars. It does. It's kind of like, for those people who know, they know that it is a city of cars. It's not exactly Detroit. Back in the 1950s and 60s, there were lots of small companies that made cars like Jowett. Jowett's like a very bespoke small company. There were dozens of these companies in Bradford, and they were basically hand-built cars, right? So it's got that heritage, but now it's something else. Now it's about modified cars. It's about people doing really outlandish, amazing, ridiculous, but I have argued creative stuff with these blank canvases until they get their hands on them, right? On top of that, there's a huge amount of infrastructure devoted to servicing the car. I'm not talking about an oil change. I'm talking about shops that sell wheels, people who paint cars, all that stuff. Economically, it's worth a fortune. So I'm having this interview with this woman. So at some point, I said, what do you think about all the cars then in Bradford? What do you think? What do you think that's about? She said, well, yes, you know what it's all about, don't you? Like, no. So I'm asking you, what do you think it's about? And she's like, well, we all know where the money comes from, don't we? Yeah. And I know what she's saying. I'm not an idiot. But I want to kind of, I'm a really shit researcher in some ways, in that I like messing with people. And that's not something that researchers tell you, right? It's good to kind of talk. I do it, I think, in a fairly sort of subtle way, in that I have fallen out with people that I've interviewed. I've walked away. I haven't actually got into fisticuffs or anything like that. But it's fine. You don't have to agree with you. Listen, if I'm interviewing somebody and they come out with some really toxic, racist shit, I don't have to listen to this, right? So this woman, she says, well, we know all the money comes from. I said, yeah. People go to the bank, they get a loan. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Well, what do you mean? It's all drugs money, isn't it? It's all drugs money. That's where all these expensive cars come from. Like, really? She goes, yeah. I says, so are you a drug dealer? She says, what? So you got a 40 grand Merc outside your drive. Where's that come from? No, I'm not talking about me. I'm not talking about people like me. People like them. And the them are, generally speaking, young people, men and women, South Asian heritage, working class heritage as well, who choose to be loud in their presence. But that's sort of ubiquitous anyway, you know, the growth of private registration plates, for example. I don't know if anybody's got one. I'm not going to disparage that. But the car has become more than just a mode of transport, right? So my point is, I guess, class is what Bourdieu says, you know, taste can induce disgust. That's what he says. For those people who do not share the same class disposition toward taste. So I found it really rich. There were lots of examples where there was sort of drama within the interviews. It wasn't like, suddenly all the kind of, the haziness lifted. It revealed itself over time. I was interested in cars for a good 10, 15 years as a bit of an aside project, in that I was doing other research around cohesion, counterterrorism, multicultural, whatever, and people would always talk about cars. So I thought, just go for it and do the cars. So one thing that is very much about class is modification. The other thing that is about class is brands. If you're white and you're middle class, you'll be perfectly happy in a Renault. It's fine. Because you don't need anything to tell the world who you are, because you have a certain amount of cultural, economic, and social capital. That does the work for you. And it's a bit like Paul Gilroy writes about cars as well. Wrote a little bit about cars. And he talked about New York and African Americans in New York. And he talked about disproportionate investment in their cars. And that, he kind of traced it. He made a very compelling argument that is kind of linked to a history of subjugation, oppression, and reclaiming a kind of agency that was hitherto ignored, right? So for me, the car stuff is still fascinating. I mean, I'm boring any of you with it. It's a very rich ground, but so too is anything to do with the idea of consumption, not necessarily consumerism, but consumption, what it is that we do with the things that we elect or choose off or become coerced to choose and consume. I'm going to talk a little bit. So this is just quite recent research has come out. There was a report dropped yesterday from Tell Mama. Don't know if anybody's heard that. Look at that. That's good, isn't it? Well, it's not good, but you know what I mean? It's extreme. Seems like, phew. And there was, I think, toward the end of last year, a report by Runnymede, Islamophobia research again, it's going up. Surprise. I mean, I shared this with a few friends, and you're a sort of WhatsApp. I don't do Instagram or anything like that. But so few friends, and the replies I generally got back were standard. Fine, yeah, it's like, yeah, it's not new to us. So it's there. The research that Isram and I are doing at the moment is around Islamophobia and HE, looking at the particular experiences of one institution. It's co-funded by the Aziz Foundation. They funded another two institutions, Loughborough and, what's the other one, Lila? De Montfort. You were there, weren't you? But you didn't know. Got to retain them. And interesting stuff's coming out. But when it comes to risks, there are risks to the sample. This has been, in a way, more demanding than the stuff on Prevent, more demanding than the stuff I did with the Force FCO, more demanding than some of the blowback I've had around some of the literature I've produced, literary fiction, in that we've gone to extremes to inoculate our sample in terms of anonymizing them, protecting them, making sure that anything that they say as data cannot be traced back to them. So that's one thing. And the amount of, in a sense, selling we've had to do to convince them that their voice might be useful in terms of us constructing a report. And we did not set out to construct a report that had a particular bent or had a particular tone or a particular view. The report is constructed on what the data showed, right? What people said in terms of their lived experiences as being Muslims in the academy. Perhaps not quite as bad is the risk that's been posed to ourselves. The amount of inoculation work that Isram and I are doing, ridiculous. Again, I mean, I can bore people with some of the details, but you are literally at risk. At times it feels like of being targeted for repercussions. I'm not saying that this is a conscious act by an institution, but it is the processes that institutions have that produce these consequences or potential consequences. So risk is part of it if you're doing insider research, if you're doing research that constitutes some kind of political act. You need to be careful. I won't talk much about this, and I don't really want to talk about Trump, but the stuff around Islamophobia in HE, you'd think wouldn't perhaps operate, and you and I had a bit of a chat about your research as well. But EDI, it seems to me, equality, diversity, and inclusion, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, or its variants, has been around for a long time within the HE sector predominantly. Other organizations as well have versions of it. Doesn't really seem to have done much. In all honesty, it doesn't seem to have done much. If you look at data around recruitment, selection, appointment, retention, progression of employees within certain sectors, no real massive change. Conversely, if you look at things like disciplinaries by ethnicity, again, same sort of thing. So although there have been some gains in some areas when it comes to what we would call in the UK protected characteristics, in others, not so much. Part of the research revealed lots of tricky issues around Palestine and Gaza in terms of how institutions have tried to deal with that or not, and how people feel about that. So EDI is there, but it has its criticisms, it has its values, and whether or not it can be leveraged to a great effect, I think, is a conversation that leaders need to have. And then, you know, we've got the embracing of decoloniality and anti-racism post George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, hashtag, 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 all that stuff that was happening. And then what? Well, people got to feel good about it for a while. I'm not sure what else has happened, really. You know, people and institutions make claims about being decolonial. What does that look like? What does that mean? Do you actually know what that means? And I'm not sure people do. I'm genuinely convinced that saying it feels almost as good as doing it, in the words of Sarah Ahmed. People end up doing the policy rather than doing the doing. I think she quotes one of her respondents in her book, right? All because you've got policies around this stuff doesn't mean to say they're real or they're enacted upon. And that's where I would say that's where we're at, that lots of institutions, not just within HE, by the way. HE is just one element of society, right? Have these tendencies, have these patterns, have these modalities of operation. And it becomes, well, to say the least, you can detect it in the processes that this is performative, because invariably there is little follow through. There is nothing there that is mapped out in terms of substantive change. So for example, when people talk about targets, right? We're going to have in 5 years' time, we're going to have this as a target. We're going to have a 5% increase on BME academics or PhD researchers of minoritized backgrounds, right? Yeah, we have that as a target. What happens if you don't? What happens if you don't? I'll tell you what happens if you don't. Nothing. Nothing happens. So I think things like accountability, being realistic are really important in these sorts of conversations. Okay, so wow, now this is the bit where I'm like, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Can I end very glibly? Some of what I've said feeds into this closing slide. I was kind of scrambling around for like 3 days, like, what the fuck? How am I going to end this? I would ask, regardless of where you are in your career, regardless of what you aspire to be, I'm assuming that the majority of people in this room are kind of a social sciences type background. Could be wrong, so apologies if I'm wrong. I would say that those sorts of disciplines, despite their kind of credentials toward things like anti-racism and decoloniality, I've actually don't necessarily have always proved that to be the case. Sociology, for example, is colonial. Let's accept that, I would say. Despite that, we operate in this context, which enables us to position ourselves. And we can only do that if we accept that we have some degree of agency. Now, how that translates into practice is when you guys are doing your research, to some extent, have that in mind. And do not be fearful of stepping out of the conventional academic journey and narrative. So, have you got a question? Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm envious because you got hair and I haven't. So the other point of this is, like, you know, it is through newer generations, through flesh, blood, that the academy can change. Otherwise, all we're going to keep doing is replicating the systems that seek to oppress people. And whatever knowledge is in the academy, knowledge is conducted through self-referential loops of knowledge creation. We said this is valid knowledge because it's been through the system. You got a viva. You did your viva, you wrote your thesis, it's done. There has to be other ways of looking at that. And if you look at scholars of the global south, if you look at people like, I don't know, people like, is it not Spivak? Homi K. Baba, people from places like South America, when they've talked about indigenous methodologies, for example. Now, I'm not saying that we need to do all that, but there is possibility for you to expand the tapestry of what it is that constitutes A, research, and B, knowledge. So ethnography is part of that. Ethnography, I fell in love with ethnography very accidentally. I was doing ethnography before I knew what it was. I'll be honest. But what I like about ethnography is you can do with it what you will. I mean, there are some parameters, there are some boundaries, but it gives you license to operate. So what I like about ethnography is it allows me to be honest. So sometimes it veers into autoethnography. So I can write what I've written in my diaries. I can show the reader my frustration with this journey. You guys can do that. I'm not saying all of you embrace become ethnographers. No, there has to be more creative methodologies that you can adopt and develop and produce a different type of knowledge which has a different type of reach, value, and purchase. And I think I'll end with that: agitate, disrupt, and subvert. It is within your gift to do that within reason. I'm not saying go out there with placards or start petrol bombing buildings. I mean, I don't think you would. But as far as the paradigm goes, it's way overdue an overhaul, right? And old farts like me aren't going to do it. Generally speaking, we're way too comfortable. We're ready to be out to pasture, but you guys is where the juice is at. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. I don't know if you'd like to share the questions. Thank you. Sorry.